Hello, welcome to Manibil. Just a few thoughts in connection with my recent video series on Absolute Philosophy, or aka Nathan Hawkins' channel and his foundational idealism. A few thoughts I want to bring to the table that I was concerning this idea of midstream philosophy, which is another way of saying, if you want to do good philosophy, at some point you need to qualify. If you're not starting with the foundations, you need to qualify whatever it is you're doing if you're philosophizing sort of further down the stream, right? Where they were not looking for any particular something down the stream of the Nile. They were looking for where did the Nile start, because there's something about why it is the way it is because of where it starts, right? And then maybe it's a stupid analogy, but there's something about when you are expressing, if you want to express your philosophy, I need to understand the expression you're using to get your philosophy across. So therefore you cannot take for granted, in my opinion, the terms you're using, because then why do you need to express anything if you're taking shit for granted? Right? It starts to get into this, well, if I take shit for granted, why can't I take everything for granted, as I pointed out? Why do I need to take this for granted, but then then use that to explain that which I apparently cannot take for granted, that you are trying to express or clarify some philosophy of yours, right? So it all eventually ends back at what are your foundational, where's the starting point of your thinking. And I was reminding myself about an old quote from Søren Kierkegaard, I think he's usually called in English, right? But he stated something like, and I'm taking it out of the context, right? I'm using it for my ends, right? So there's actually a Danish writer who wrote about Søren Kierkegaard and used this as I think that's the title, right? And the title was, or the quote is, you have to understand life backwards, but you can only live it forwards. So there's sort of an appeal to time and an understanding, and directional understanding of how you live your life. And if you transform that into philosophizing, then in order to philosophize about the now and the future, you need to present how you understand the past. Or in the structure, it's not a temporal understanding, it's not about time, but it's an understanding about what leads to what in your philosophy, right? So if everything you are talking about isn't disconnected completely from each other, then there must be some interdependency, right? And the way you present your philosophy is some kind of argument, which is an appeal to a structure, which is an appeal to a foundation. As soon as you bring in some kind of interconnectivity, you are appealing to a foundation. I mean, it has to be, right? Otherwise, I mean, you're trying to fool me, right? But, as is the point also with Nathan Hawkins, he is presenting philosophy as if all that which he uses is just sort of handed to him, right? And he doesn't need to clarify, he doesn't need to explain, he doesn't need to define. Maybe he does it to some extent, but some other shit is not explained then, right? So it sort of bites its own tail. It becomes a circular argument. or it becomes a disconnected argument, maybe, right? Because what is it connected to? Well, I can take my understandings of the terms you're using to explain your philosophy, but isn't it your task as somebody presenting a philosophy to present what you mean by the terms used? And if you don't need that, who's going to determine the understanding of the terms used? Who is that authority? Well, then you are appealing to an undisclosed proto-ontology or proto-metaphysics or whatever, right? Whatever foundational philosophy you're dealing with or you're working from. Then you need to disclose that then, right? And if you're disclosing somebody else's philosophy, why didn't you make your own then, right? So you can't get around it. You can't get around. You have to deal out your own philosophy. Otherwise, I'm not going to trust it, right? You can say that, well, I can't seem to find anything better than, for instance, Nathan Hawkins, whatever it is, his ontology, right? Okay, fair enough. If I don't agree with Nathan Hawkins, then I won't agree with you, right? And I would also be kind of worried that if you can't find a good ontology yourself, how can you judge whether somebody else's ontology and all sorts of other derivative philosophy is good or functional or correct? How do you do that, right? Well, you can't, right? It's like somebody says, I don't know anything about bicycling, but this guy is a really world-class bicycle rider. How do you do that? If you don't know really about, you're not very good at bicycling, how can you tell me who's the best to ride a bicycle? And if you cannot do your own ontology / metaphysics and epistemology and clarify when you're doing what and how you do it, how are you going to tell me that you're just going to grab somebody else's definitions and ontology and so on and just run with it? I'm not buying that, right? So, and that's basically the problem of academia. Everybody is just more confused about all these things they have been told are sort of, this is a very important philosopher who said this, so therefore you should take it seriously. Why? No, don't lecture me, right? I mean, I can think for myself, or at least I should be able to, right? I should make a virtue out of thinking for myself. Because otherwise you're just saying, oh, I can't think for myself, so I'm going to take somebody else serious who can think for himself, apparently, right? I'm not buying that. So it seems to me that somebody like Nathan Hawkins just wants to sound like he's smart, sound like he's just going to, okay, now I have government papers that I'm smart, I have to create something so people think I'm actually quite smart, right? All it's basically doing is just juggling terms around that make you think that he's smart, right? So I have to go somewhere, but it's fucking pouring down. I don't want to step out into rainy weather just yet. So maybe I can, well, I could turn off the ignition, right? And take off my safety belt. What's it called? Safety belt? I think it's you can judge whether somebody is a good philosopher or not to the degree they take shit for granted. Because how did they enable themselves to take shit for granted? What's the principle behind, well, I'm taking this for granted? Implicitly, maybe, just, right? They're not maybe stating, yeah, I can take this for granted, but this other thing I need to explain using that shit I took for granted. What is it what is that lack of insight? Well, I would say it's the grooming of authority. It's the grooming of authoritarian, that if you go to university, right, you cannot sit there as a green little student and say, I'm going to think for myself. That's why I'm here. You have to go into a mode of, these are authorities. Otherwise, why would I listen to them? Why would I maybe even pay tens of thousands of euros or dollars to get this guy or girl speaking to me, right? Is it just to get these, as I call it, government papers? Or is it because I actually believe that I am on a lower level of quality of philosophy, but they must be an authority, and they can somehow channel through language me becoming a better and equal, and even equal philosopher just by listening to them. But my point would be, well, what is philosophy? What is it about? It's about thinking. It's not about listening, right? I'm not saying you can't listen and you can get inspired. But deep down, it's about you thinking about your thinking, because you're the one who can think, and you have the thinking you need to think about, right? The ground floor of philosophy, the starting point, is solipsist. You have to reject an external world. Otherwise, you're taking it for granted, right? All shit that you take for granted, you have to reject, at least at first. And then you can build from your foundation. And at some point, you might get to, for instance, an external world, right? And define what you mean by that, right? Just because somebody came up with the idea of an external world doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accommodate that, right? Just because somebody came up with pluralism or dualism or mind and matter problems or whatever, doesn't mean you necessarily have to accommodate that. It might be a faulty kind of, flawed kind of philosophy. And if you can do some very rigid foundational philosophy, you might end up in a situation where, that you went wrong, back there at that crossroad that actually wasn't a crossroad. And that's why you ended up with whatever, external world, mind, matter problem, whatever, right? For instance, I think the heart problem is not a problem to be solved, but a case of bad thinking, right? If you have this bad thinking, you end up with this paradox called the heart problem. It's a paradox, right? It's because of a foundational paradox in your thinking that you are allowed to carry on, and therefore you end up with what has become known as the heart problem, right? So I can't think of anybody besides myself who this clearly states that philosophy is about thinking for yourself. Because those who are really, really taking that to heart, so to say, right? They're not talking, right? They're not talking to me. They're basically some kind of, maybe not solipsist, but very introvert in a kind of philosophy. Those who are very outspoken are those who do not understand this, right? Or maybe they don't understand it quite as deeply as they maybe should. So it's like those you would want to communicate with are less likely to communicate, in a way, you could say, right? And those you really bump into are those who are very outspoken about philosophy being some kind of oral adventure, right? So how do you go about it? There's basically almost a contradiction built into me sitting here telling you that those you should listen to are those who are not talking, right? I mean, maybe it's not that ridiculous, but there's something to it, right? If you're very concerned about thinking about your own thinking, you might not be concerned about telling it to somebody else, right? I would say that if you stick to metaphysics, ontology, you basically don't need to communicate because you're still in a solipsist mode, right? if you're trying to define what you mean by knowledge, and an external world combined with knowledge, maybe, right? Maybe then you are sort of starting to be concerned about that object there might be somebody like me who has the same desires and incentives, whatever, that may or may not influence my life, right? And thereby you maybe should eventually come up with a moral principle, right? So at that point you might want to communicate, because if your moral principle is, if you have to be in agreement with somebody, how can you be in agreement with them without communicating? Right? Tell me that. How can you be in agreement with somebody without communicating some way or another, right? Be that smoke signals or, painting, it doesn't necessarily have to be oral or writing or something like that. Whatever communication, how would you be in agreement, and what would you have to agree about, right? And how would that lead back to epistemology and ontology, right? That's what I would be concerned about. And that's the point where I think that communication is necessary. And that's basically why I'm sitting here talking. And that's why I call it the perfect principle, which to me is another way of saying moral principle, right? A moral principle has to be perfect, or perfect in relation to all other principles you could possibly imagine, right? So that's my talk for today. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.